So welcome back, folks. We've got Andolyn and myself are here. Jennifer is here also, so she can help us with trying to figure out Kentucky-specific sorts of things. We don't have any agenda for this morning, and what we're hoping to do is simply, as you have questions or things you want us to go back over, we can do that. And I think a lot of times that either kind of makes light bulbs come on and things click into place, or it raises 6 other questions, and then we can try to address those. So I would encourage folks, if you have questions coming into this, if you want to put those into the Q&A box, and then we can start to work with those. Jennifer, anything, since we're getting started here, any sort of follow-up things from yesterday's session that you want to comment on?
I do not have anything listed. I'm sorry, but I don't. I'm glad to see everyone online this morning. I'm glad to say we have such attendance. I'm curious to hear their questions.
Yeah. So I'll just sort of make a few observational comments. We have had, this has sort of been a process with HUD's guidance and HUD kind of launching this a little after the fact. It would have been great to have had all of this well in advance, so everybody was up to speed before the November 30th, 2020 effective date on this. Andolyn and I were on a call earlier this morning, and we were told that within the next couple of weeks, there are going to be, I think they said they thought around 10 additional tools that are going to be released. So we mentioned yesterday about signing up on the HUD exchange to be notified when those come out. And we'll also keep an eye on those, let Jennifer know about those, and some of them that might be kind of key for DLG recipients. We also may, send out notices or those sorts of things. So we've got a couple of questions coming in. So what is the timeline on the contractor guidance documents revisions? So I think the only thing that we need to do is finalize some the clauses that you need to put into your agreements. I would think, and Jennifer, you may want to correct me on this, I would think that we should be able to get those done within the next 2 weeks.
I know I've had Trey working on this, and I see Trey's online. He's asked a question. He has gone over our contract guide. Our next step is when we can snatch our lawyer, because he's super busy, and get him to go over the contracts, and then we'll submit them to you to see what you think, or we might propose. I don't know if we'll have it in 2 weeks, but
okay,
we'll try our best. And once we do have it, what I can do once we have it finalized, maybe I'll do a mass email to everyone.
Yeah.
Trey, don't let me forget that.
And so I guess the question that would come to mind on that, I would assume we have folks who are in the process on a project and needing to figure out, do I hold off or do I go back and revise after executing documents? I know some folks will have language in written agreements that say both parties agree to, updates if needed to comply with the regulations. I don't know, Jennifer, do you guys have any guidance for folks on, depending on where they are in this process, whether to go ahead or wait? I mean, you've already got a You've already got a Section 3 action plan, which you would be requiring, you could be requiring contractors and others to adopt as part of that. So you certainly could put special condition language in that tied them to that.
I would say at this point in time, if they wanted to just try to update that language themselves to say that they will comply with the rule, and then we'll.
Yeah.
Trey just said he'd set us a reminder. We'll try to get that done. Hopefully, we can get with Matt, our lawyer, next week.
Because they're really just, you're moving from, I would think a lot of agreements are simply going to reference the regulation and probably include the Part 135, which was the old rule. If that's simply updated to be Part 75, that may cover you. You know, we always recommend to folks that, you know, to me, a written agreement is a little bit of, it's a little more art than it is science. So you want to list out requirements that you were holding folks to, but on some of those you always may want to consider some additional narrative, something a little more user friendly. So, you know, adding some language about that they are agreeing to the Section 3 plan and the actions, they're going to undertake the actions that are described in that, might also be something that you could, for now, also include in that agreement.
And like I said, we'll put that up on the top of our to-do list for next week.
Okay. So we have a question from Trey about going over the subordination to other regulations. And the issue here is that, you know, Section 3 has language about trying to reach these goals, but it does not it does not usurp the other requirements that you have in place that might limit some of those actions. So, you know, for instance, we've heard from grantees in on the West Coast who had some very specific regulations about questions that they could ask folks about, such as income, and so it had an impact on the outreach that they were able to do. I think probably a better example is you have requirements about procurement. So you've got a state procurement code that you are following. So you could not, as part of your you know, goal on advancing Section 3, choose to do something as part of your procurement process that violated the state procurement code. And so you have to work within the confines of federal, state, local laws and regulations on that. So just kind of keep that in mind. Let's see. All right, so we've got a question. Carrie mentioned that an employee may have been hired to work on a non-scale job, and therefore they might have been hired at a lower rate that you could perhaps qualify them at Section 3. Did I understand that correctly? So when we talk about the qualifying workers and looking at income and being able to certify that based on their wage rate is where I think we got into those questions. So we have two options to make an employee eligible or certify them as being eligible. We can look to what their current pay rate is, and we also can look at the pay rate when they were hired. So we are going to have, and particularly, I know, I worked in Ohio for many years, which I would say for the most part, workers were not necessarily union workers, so that they were at a standard rate for all jobs. So when we were, putting CDBG funds into a project and triggering Davis-Bacon, we were triggering a higher wage rate than their standard wage rate on that. So I believe, and I've not seen any FAQs on this, but I would believe that what their standard pay rate, not project specific, would be what you would use as part of that certification, particularly when you're looking back to when they were hired. I think we probably need to send a question through to HUD on this issue. I don't think they've considered this idea that you're going to have some workers that, depending on the job, are going to be paid a different wage rate. You know, we kind of talked about pairing that documentation from Davis-Bacon that we're already receiving as part of the way we're tracking and being able to document some of this. So the idea that the CDBG project that you're funding, having triggered Davis-Bacon, is triggering a particular wage rate that may not be their normal wage rate. I don't think HUD has kind of considered that. Andolin, have you heard any discussion that would kind of solve that quandary?
I have not. I have not. I think this is a really good question. And so I've recorded it so that we can request clarification from HUD. And
yeah, we have, because we're doing ongoing work for HUD on Section 3, we have folks that are having a weekly meeting with HUD. So that does give us an opportunity to route questions to them and ask them in those meetings to verify. So I think this is a really good question that no one so far in the country has asked, and it makes a lot of sense. I think probably the assumption on HUD's part is that, you know, workers have one wage rate that they're always being paid, but that's really not necessarily true. So I'm going to say we will take this question, try to get a solid answer from HUD, and then provide that back to Jennifer, and we can then disseminate that information back to folks. It's a great question. I wish I had a great answer for you on that. So I guess one thing I would ask for participants, as you are kind of mulling over the information from our sessions, what things are you concerned about as you know, being a challenge to be able to do? I think that would be very interesting for us to hear, and maybe we can have a little bit of interaction on you know, ways to deal with that, perhaps, or what we're hearing from other folks on this. Go ahead.
we did get a question. What is the timeline on the contractor guidance document revisions?
That's actually what we were talking about with this needing to get the attorneys to sign off on language. There's a contract guide that's part of their sort of a subset of the handbook, which has that standard language in it that needs to be updated.
I apologize. I thought it just popped up. I see it was at 10:03.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, let's walk through a scenario since they're being kind of quiet. You know,
Okay.
yesterday we talked about a co-funding project with CDBG RD, and we just talked about water lines. What if they have they consider the whole entire project, water treatment plant and a line extension. But they're two separate contracts, but they're still part of the entire project. Let's say CDBG is just in the lines with RD and RD's in the plant. They're the only one funding the plant. So does the contract that covers the plant, is that still subject to Section 3 or just the water lines that CDBG is in?
So it goes back to defining the project. And so we had a slide, I think yesterday morning, where on our definition of a project, it's common ownership, financing. And so when they on a project like this, when they've come to CDBG, what does that application, is that application only for the water lines, or is it describing the whole project? And then, some portion of that's being paid with different sources.
Let's say the application itself states contract 1 will be the water treatment plant with RD funding, and contract 2 will be the water lines with the combo.
But the way this is defined is not by contracts.
Right, it's about the project.
It's what the project is. And so similar to with the environmental review, you would be looking to see what is the undertaking as we describe it, not just what we're funding for this. And so the impact of this, it gets tricky here because of if the contract is being executed by RD, they themselves are not being held to Section 3 requirements. But if your CDBG fund, I'm assuming in this scenario, we've got more than $200,000 in CDBG funds. It's public infrastructure. So we are triggering Section 3 for the whole project. And so we have to report on total labor hours for the entire project. And we need to be able to then collect out of that. We need that contractor to be helpful in providing the reporting that's needed. So I would think as part of this joint project with RD that you're going to be saying to them, this with our funding is, as one project, is triggering Section 3. We're going to, because of that, we have to be able to collect this information to be able to report for compliance. And so we're going to need you to incorporate some language into your contract so that we are able to collect, because we need total labor and our qualifying workers for the overall project.
So they would have to get it on the treatment plant.
I believe so.
Part of the project.
If
That
it's
was
part
my
of the project.
understanding.
Yeah.
That was my understanding.
And so, I mean, I think oftentimes when you are doing a joint project with a couple of funding sources, there are some implications because, you're triggering, in some cases, depending on who the other funds are. I'll use just the example in like multifamily housing where, you're putting in federal dollars and they might be using tax credits and private lenders, which are not triggering environmental review. They might not be triggering Davis-Bacon, but your funding is causing that for the whole project. So it is one of those where you're going to have to work with those partners on the front end, identifying, this is going to be a Section 3 project, and so that's the information that we're going to need. Now, in this scenario, Jennifer, would you presume that this is going to be a Davis-Bacon project, and would RD already have included language on Davis-Bacon in their agreements?
I think RD does require Davis Bacon now. I don't think they used to, but I think they do now.
Okay.
Uh,
So
but we would
some of,
trigger it.
yeah, so some of the information that you would need and some of the, I suppose, obligation for that contractor is being triggered already, since they're having to do some reporting. But on all of these, it's that being able to have that conversation on the front end is kind of critical to being able to make this easy for folks.
Thank you.
And that's the challenge that everybody is facing, is that ideally on any of these changes to regulations, we need, like at least a year probably to not only figure out what those requirements are, get everybody up to speed, but then be able to modify systems, get out in front on all of these projects and be able to incorporate any changes that need to be made. And we are in that sort of catch-up mode, unfortunately, on this. And I do think HUD recognizes that. And I don't know, we talked yesterday about the fact that we have this transition period where you were required to, between November 30th, 2020 and July 1st of 21, that you were required to follow the new regs but not report on them. And I don't know if that was as a way to try to minimize a little bit in that transition period as people adapted their programs, or it simply was they weren't sure that they would have the reporting systems modified in time to be able to do that. And Jennifer, one question I was thinking about as we were doing the training the other day, and we described what public construction is and talked about, it's going to be all of our infrastructure projects. And I used the example then for economic development, where we're providing funding to a private for-profit entity, and they're going to be buying land and building a new facility, and saying, that's not public construction. As I recall, is DLG at times doing things where a unit of local government might be acquiring and building a facility that they were going to own and then lease to a business? Or are those being done by you've got local development agencies? Who owns those?
Now, sometimes what we'll have with economic development is you might have like the local economic development might build the building and lease it out
Okay.
on that part. So they would be the owner. Now, sometimes with ED, we do just equipment purchases for a specific piece of equipment.
Okay.
And sometimes we run infrastructure to the facility. Now, my understanding, even though it's an economic development, but we're running water and sewer to the facility, that is public infrastructure.
That's
it would
public.
be section
Yeah, that's
3.
public construction. No way around that. I think where we might have to ponder and ask a few more questions would be if we were providing funding for construction of a facility that was owned by a unit of government and then leased to a private entity, whether that would be considered public construction or not. And I think, I'm trying to recall language on that, isn't there something in the language about, is the grant that's being made by the local, if we had a facility that was being built and then was going to be leased, would the UGLUG have a agreement with that local development agency, and they would then have construction contracts? How does that work? Or are these actually happening and we should not really go down this path any further?
Now Trey's on here and he works with Gabe under economic development, so he might want to chime in. But I think what they do is we go through the UGLUG, but they have an agreement with the economic development
Okay.
authority and lay out what's what there. So
Okay. So I think if that's the case, that may well be outside of that public construction, but we may want to keep an eye on those and look at a couple of those scenarios as we go forward.
Melissa Melton is online and she works for RD now. So she's reminded me that RD does not require Davis-Bacon. It's the other funding agencies that come into play that funds it.
Okay.
Like CDBG, ARC,
Okay.
SRF.
So
Thank
they're
you.
used to, on projects where you have that combination of having another funding source triggering requirements for the overall project, and this fits in that same category.
Yes, and when we have that, we'll enter into, like, it might be 2 contracts, but with our contract, all of that language is in there. So we
And
have the Davis-Bacon and the Section 3 and all the applicable laws.
okay. And so let's tweak that scenario just a little bit. We sometimes then have where projects are phased. So, maybe there's an application for funding for the water treatment plant, but maybe a second application for funding, so separate financing, would be for the water line project. So in those cases where there's separate funding on that, so they came in as separate packages that were the funding was put together on, then those are 2 separate projects. So we always have to go back to that question of how do we define what the project is, total project as part of that, and go back to that definition. So it looks like we've got another question in. So wastewater projects that are in excess of $200,000 are going to trigger, but water projects do not. No, so I think any of these, whether it's a wastewater project, whether it's a water line extension, those are all going to be considered public construction. And so they all are going to be one of the eligible activities that's going to trigger Section 3. And so then the question is, are you going to exceed that $200,000 threshold, which I would guess probably almost all of these are. And so you are going to be triggering Section 3 as part of that. All right, here's a question. So we've got another scenario. Funding is 100% CDBG housing project, and construction of infrastructure is budgeted at $400,000, architect engineering 81,000, admin developer fee. Construction of duplex is $350,000. If the infrastructure is contracted separately for water, sewer, blah, 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 will Section 3 trigger on the separate contract? So again, it goes back to, it's not the contract, it is the project. And so when that application came for CDBG, the project was I'm presuming described as it's a housing project and it includes all of these expenses. You were asking for CDBG for some part of this project, but the overall project is the development of the housing, and all of these costs that come with that. So that's under then common ownership and financing on this. And so that's, if that's the way this has been done, it is going to be considered a project. And so Section 3 will apply for all of those contracts. It applies for the overall project. And so we're going to be collecting total labor hours, not only from the specific contract that CDBG was paying for, but everything that is part of that project. That's probably not the answer that you were hoping for. All right. Trying to think if there are any other sort of common questions that we've gotten that we probably want to go over. We talked yesterday about this sort of in the same line of defining what the project is, and we've oftentimes have confusion between projects and programs. And so the sort of common example of that, you might be funding a local community to run a program where they were then going to take applications and assist individuals for something. And you don't really do a lot of this, but housing rehab is the most sort of common example of that. Of course, that's one of our triggering activities. So we kind of went through that scenario yesterday that our project, since we have different owners for each of those units that are applying for assistance, each one of those is a project itself. And so we're applying that must exceed $200,000 threshold to each one of those units. And that's why I raised in the scenario yesterday, if we were doing reconstruction, and so those units actually might go over the $200,000 threshold, then those individual projects would be triggering. The other part of that scenario would be if you were funding as part of a neighborhood redevelopment program, and you were funding one owner to do multiple, maybe they're doing a scattered site, they've acquired a number of units in a neighborhood, and so the project is maybe 6 units. So then we apply that threshold to our project, and in that case, of course, with 6 units, we're much more likely to be exceeding the $200,000 limit, and so triggering the Section 3 for that. And Andelin, I saw a question pop up and that looked like you may have answered it. Is that something we should share with the group, or was it just a... And you're on mute, I believe. You're unusually quiet.
Someone asked if we could convert the email PDF and make it a little bit larger and resend it. So I just said that we would get that done.
Perfect. Okay.
Absolutely.
All right. So we may have run through the questions that folks have. I'm going to suggest we stay for a few minutes here and keep things open. And if not, then we'll maybe end our session early, give folks back a little bit of time in your day. But I guess the one thing I would suggest, we've got new things that people are dealing with. And we would really recommend, as you have scenarios that you're trying to figure out what applies, talk to DLG. We'll work with DLG where we've got things that there are not clear answers. We'll use our ability to get an answer from headquarters quickly, which is not always easy to do, and try to help you on those. But I would encourage folks, as you're kind of pondering what's going to apply to my particular project, I would ask those questions and let's figure them out as we go on that. So Jennifer, I'm thinking we've probably run the course here. Anything you want to add, or you want to for us to keep it open for a bit, or what's your preference?
I say we can go ahead and call it. I do appreciate everybody that did get online this morning. They did have some good questions. And as you said, if they have more as they pop up, they can email them to me, and we'll either try to answer them ourselves or I'll give you a call.
Right. And we will do some research on that great question about, what wage rate do we use when we've got workers that sometimes are being paid one rate versus another, and we'll provide that information back to DLG and work on getting that out to folks. Thanks, everybody. Keep us in mind as questions come up. Have a good day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.